Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history from the remote mountains of Appalachia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The autumn of 1923 brought an unusual chill to the hollers of Pendleton County, West Virginia. Those who lived through that season would later speak of it in whispers, not because of the early frost that killed the late harvest, but because of what emerged from the cabin at the end of Sourwood Ridge. The official records from that time are sparse, typical of rural mountain communities where comings and goings were often recorded weeks or months after the fact, if at all. But what makes this case particularly unsettling is not what was documented, but what was deliberately omitted from every official record. Cordelia Ashworth had been a widow for nearly 3 years when the first reports reached the county seat in Franklin. She lived alone in a 2-room cabin built by her late husband Zachariah, who had died in a logging accident in the winter of 1920. The cabin sat at the terminus of a narrow dirt road that wound through dense stands of oak and hickory, climbing steadily for nearly 4 miles from the nearest neighbor. Local residents described Cordelia as a woman who kept to herself, emerging from her mountain retreat only for essential supplies and the occasional church service. What changed everything was the arrival of Hiram Kincaid in the late summer of 1923. No one could say exactly when he had appeared at the Ashworth cabin or where he had come from. The first mention of his presence appears in the records of Dr. Augustus Penfield, the county's only practicing physician at the time. Dr. Penfield, a graduate of the Medical College of Virginia, had established his practice in Franklin in 1919, drawn by what he believed would be a simple rural practice treating common ailments and injuries. His medical journal, discovered in 1963 during the renovation of the old Franklin courthouse, contains an entry dated November 15, 1923, that reads simply, "Called to examine C. Ashworth's companion, declined payment, will not be returning to that location." What preceded this terse note was a journey that Dr. Penfield would later describe in private correspondence with a colleague as the most disturbing professional encounter of his career. According to a letter found among his personal effects after his death in 1954, Cordelia Ashworth had appeared at his office in the pre-dawn hours of November 12, 1923. She was accompanied by what Dr. Penfield initially described as a large man of perhaps 30 years, though his exact age was difficult to determine due to certain physical irregularities. The man was Hiram Kincaid, and according to Cordelia Ashworth, he was someone who had come to stay with her after Zachariah's death. Church records, when they could finally be located decades later, contained no mention of any formal arrangement or family relationship. The only reference appears as an unusual notation in the margin of the congregation book, written in different ink, H. Kincaid, circumstances unknown, examined by physician. Additional documentation filed separately. The separate documentation was never found, despite extensive searches of church archives conducted by researchers in the 1960s. However, members of the congregation who were interviewed many years later recalled whispered conversations about the Ashworth woman's guest and how he weren't like anyone they'd seen before, not in all their years in these mountains. Dr. Penfield's letter to his colleague provides the only detailed medical description of Hiram that survives today. He wrote, "The patient presented with what can only be described as extraordinary physical characteristics. His height approached 7 feet, with a corresponding but disproportionate muscle mass that gave him an imposing presence. More troubling were the irregularities in his facial structure, particularly around the orbital bones and jaw, which created an appearance that was simultaneously human and, somehow, other. His hands were notably large, with fingers that seemed too long for even his considerable frame. Most disturbing of all was his gaze, which possessed an intensity and intelligence that seemed to penetrate beyond mere observation. The doctor's examination, according to his private records, lasted less than 20 minutes. During that time, Hiram spoke only once in what Dr. Penfield described as a voice that resonated from somewhere deeper than the chest, carrying undertones that seemed to vibrate in the bones. When asked about his health, Hiram had replied, "I am as I was made to be, and I am becoming as I was meant to become." It was this statement, more than his unusual physical characteristics, that prompted Dr. Penfield to end the examination abruptly and refuse payment for his services. In his letter he wrote, "There was something in the way he spoke those words, as if he possessed knowledge of his own nature that exceeded normal human understanding. I found myself suddenly and inexplicably fearful, not of physical harm, but of something far more fundamental. It was as if I was in the presence of something that challenged the very assumptions upon which I had built my understanding of human biology and development." When Dr. Penfield inquired about Hiram's origins or how he had come to be living with Cordelia, both individuals provided vague and inconsistent answers. Cordelia mentioned that he had arrived when she needed help most, and that he had nowhere else to go. Hiram himself said only that he had been traveling for a long time and had found the place where his work could be done. The nature of this work would become increasingly apparent in the months that followed. According to county records, the winter of 1923-1924 was one of the harshest on record in the region. Snow began falling in early December and continued intermittently through March, effectively cutting off many of the remote mountain cabins from the outside world for months at a time. It was during this period of isolation that residents of the Sourwood Ridge area began reporting disturbing occurrences. Jeremiah Cutler, who lived approximately 2 miles down the mountain from the Ashworth cabin, reported to the county sheriff that he had been hearing sounds from the direction of Cordelia's property throughout the winter months. According to his statement, filed in the spring of 1924, these were not normal sounds of human habitation, but rather a kind of rhythmic pounding, like someone working metal, but going on for hours at a time, sometimes through the whole night. Other neighbors reported similar disturbances. Ezekiel Brennan, whose property bordered the lower edge of Cordelia's land, claimed to have seen lights moving through the trees around the Ashworth cabin at all hours of the night. He described these lights as not like lantern light or firelight, but something whiter and colder, moving in patterns that didn't make sense for someone just going about normal business. Perhaps most disturbing were the reports from the McCain family, who lived at the intersection where the road to Sourwood Ridge branched off from the main valley road. Throughout the winter, family members reported encountering tracks in the snow that they could not identify. The tracks were described as human-like, but significantly larger than those of any normal adult, with what appeared to be deep gouges or marks accompanying each footprint. These tracks often appeared overnight, leading from the direction of the ridge down into the valley, but they never seemed to return. When spring finally arrived and travel became possible again, Sheriff Cornelius Yates organized an expedition to check on the isolated families who had been cut off during the winter. The party consisted of Sheriff Yates, his deputy Marcus Tolliver, and 2 local men who knew the mountain roads well. According to the official report filed by Sheriff Yates, they reached the Ashworth cabin on April 8, 1924. The cabin appeared to be in good condition, with fresh wood stacked outside and signs of recent habitation. Smoke was rising from the chimney, and the ground around the building showed evidence of regular activity throughout the winter. However, when the sheriff knocked on the door, the response they received was unlike anything they had expected. According to the report, Cordelia Ashworth answered the door, but seemed reluctant to allow the men inside or to discuss her winter in any detail. She assured them that she and Hiram had weathered the season well and had adequate supplies to last until the roads fully cleared. When Sheriff Yates asked to speak with Hiram directly, Cordelia explained that he was working on the property and could not come to the door at that moment. What struck the men as particularly odd was the condition of the area around the cabin. The ground was churned and torn in patterns that suggested some kind of large-scale construction or excavation project had been undertaken. Trees in the surrounding area had been stripped of bark in irregular patterns, some up to heights of 12 feet or more. Most puzzling of all was what appeared to be a series of deep holes or shafts dug into the hillside behind the cabin, each approximately 6 feet in diameter and extending down into the earth beyond the reach of the sheriff's lantern. When questioned about these disturbances, Cordelia explained that Hiram had been working on improvements to the property during the winter months. She was vague about the specific nature of these improvements and became visibly agitated when pressed for details. Sheriff Yates noted in his report that throughout the conversation there was a persistent sound of movement from within the cabin, as if someone of considerable size was moving around in the back room. The sheriff's party left the cabin that day with more questions than answers. In his final notes on the visit, Sheriff Yates wrote, "Something is not right at the Ashworth place, but I cannot put my finger on exactly what. The woman seems healthy enough, if nervous, and claims her guest is well. However, there are aspects of the situation that do not align with normal human habitation. The extensive ground disturbance, the modified trees, and most particularly the excavated shafts suggest activity that goes well beyond typical property improvements. I am recommending that we maintain periodic contact with the Ashworth household throughout the coming year." This recommendation was never formally implemented. Sheriff Yates died of a heart attack in June 1924, and his replacement, Sheriff William Dockery, was more focused on issues in the county seat than on the remote mountain communities. As a result, the Ashworth cabin was largely forgotten by official authority for several years. However, unofficial attention to the property continued among the local residents. Throughout 1924 and into 1925, the strange reports persisted, and if anything intensified. The sounds of nighttime activity became more frequent and more varied. Residents described not only the rhythmic pounding that had been reported earlier, but also sounds that defied easy categorization. Multiple witnesses spoke of hearing what they described as singing coming from the direction of the ridge, but singing unlike anything they had heard before. Martha Brennan, wife of Ezekiel, provided perhaps the most detailed description of these sounds in an interview conducted many years later by a researcher studying Appalachian folklore. According to Martha, the singing typically began around midnight and could continue for hours. She described it as multiple voices, but all the same voice, if that makes sense. Like one person singing harmony with themselves, but the harmonies were in notes that didn't exist in any music I knew. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, and it seemed to come from the very ground itself. The isolation of the Sourwood Ridge area meant that these reports remained largely within the local community. However, in the autumn of 1925, an event occurred that finally brought outside attention to the Ashworth property. A traveling minister named Reverend Matthias Groves was conducting a revival circuit through the mountain communities when he decided to make an unannounced visit to the Ashworth cabin to invite the residents to attend his services. Reverend Groves' account of this visit, preserved in his personal journal and later donated to the archives of the West Virginia Historical Society, provides the most detailed description we have of Hiram Kincaid from someone outside the immediate community. The Reverend arrived at the cabin in the early afternoon of October 14, 1925, and found Hiram working alone in what appeared to be a large garden plot behind the main building, the Reverend wrote. I encountered a man of such unusual appearance that I was initially uncertain whether I was looking at a human being or some manner of creature I had never before seen. His size was remarkable, towering above my own height of 6 feet by at least 12 inches, with a build that suggested both tremendous strength and an oddly graceful coordination. His features, while recognizably human, were arranged in a configuration that created an overall impression of something not quite natural. What most struck Reverend Groves, however, was not Hiram's physical appearance, but his behavior and apparent capabilities. The garden plot in which he was working extended over several acres and was laid out in patterns that the Reverend described as geometrically complex, with plantings arranged in spirals and interlocking circles that seemed to follow some mathematical principle rather than practical agricultural needs. More disturbing was what Hiram was doing with the soil itself. According to Reverend Groves, Hiram was working the earth with his bare hands, moving rocks and boulders that would normally require multiple men and tools to relocate. The Reverend watched in fascination as Hiram lifted a stone that appeared to weigh several hundred pounds and placed it precisely in what seemed to be a predetermined location. When Reverend Groves called out a greeting, Hiram turned to face him with what the Reverend described as immediate and complete awareness, as if he had known of my presence long before I made myself known. The conversation that followed was brief, but left a lasting impression on the traveling minister. Hiram spoke in the same deep, resonant voice that Dr. Penfield had noted, but his words were careful and measured, as if each phrase was being considered for multiple meanings before being spoken. When invited to attend the revival services, Hiram replied, "I have my own relationship with the powers that govern existence. I do not require intermediation." Reverend Groves pressed further, asking about Hiram's faith and spiritual beliefs. Hiram's response, as recorded in the Reverend's journal, was, "I understand the nature of creation more directly than those who rely on books and buildings. The earth teaches what the earth knows. The depths reveal what the depths contain. I am learning from teachers you do not acknowledge." It was this reference to the depths that seemed to unsettle Reverend Groves most profoundly. He noted that as Hiram spoke these words, the man gestured toward the hillside behind the cabin, where the mysterious shafts had been dug the previous winter. The Reverend observed that these excavations had been expanded considerably since Sheriff Yates's visit, with what appeared to be a network of tunnels connecting the various shafts. Reverend Groves attempted to inquire about the purpose of these excavations, but Hiram's demeanor changed noticeably. The careful, measured tone became more distant, and he explained simply that he was preparing spaces for what is to come. When pressed for clarification, Hiram added, "The time approaches when the barriers become thin. Preparation must be made for what will emerge." The Reverend left the Ashworth property that day with a profound sense of unease that he struggled to articulate in his journal. He wrote, "I have encountered many individuals in my travels who have been touched by madness or who hold beliefs outside the mainstream of Christian doctrine. But this man seemed to possess a clarity and certainty that suggested his words were not the product of delusion, but of some form of knowledge that exists outside normal human experience. Most troubling was the sense that he was not merely waiting for something to happen, but actively working to bring it about." Reverend Groves shared his concerns with several families in the area, but found little appetite among the local residents for any kind of intervention. The mountain communities had always been characterized by a strong tradition of self-reliance and non-interference in the affairs of neighbors, regardless of how unusual those affairs might appear. Additionally, many of the residents harbored a superstitious fear of Hiram that made them reluctant to take any action that might draw his attention. The winter of 1925-1926 passed more quietly than the previous year, with fewer reports of strange sounds or activities from the direction of Sourwood Ridge. However, this apparent calm was shattered in the spring when a catastrophic event occurred that fundamentally altered the relationship between the Ashworth property and the surrounding community. On the morning of May 3, 1926, residents throughout the Sourwood Ridge area were awakened by what they described as an earthquake. The tremor was significant enough to be felt over a radius of several miles and caused minor damage to buildings throughout the valley. However, when officials from the State Geological Survey arrived to investigate, they found no evidence of seismic activity that could account for the reported disturbance. More puzzling was the discovery that the epicenter of the tremor appeared to be located precisely beneath the Ashworth property. Geological instruments placed in the area detected continuing minor vibrations emanating from deep underground near the site of Hiram's excavations. These vibrations followed a pattern that geologists described as rhythmic and sustained, unlike any natural seismic activity they had previously encountered. When investigators attempted to examine the excavation site directly, they were confronted by Hiram himself, who refused to allow access to his property. Contemporary newspaper accounts describe a tense standoff that lasted several days, with Hiram maintaining a constant presence at the entrance to his tunnel system and clearly prepared to use physical force if necessary to prevent intrusion. The situation was resolved when Cordelia Ashworth agreed to allow a limited inspection of the surface areas of the property in exchange for assurances that the underground excavations would not be disturbed. The compromise satisfied the immediate concerns of the authorities while allowing Hiram to maintain control over what he clearly considered to be the most important aspect of his work. The official report filed by the Geological Survey team provides a clinical but nonetheless disturbing description of what they found. The excavation system had been expanded into what could only be described as a complex underground installation. The original shafts had been connected by a series of tunnels that extended horizontally into the hillside for distances that the investigators could not determine without specialized equipment. Most remarkable was the construction technique that had been employed. The walls of the tunnels were smooth and precisely formed, without any evidence of tool marks or standard excavation methods. The investigators noted that the rock and soil had been removed with a precision that suggested tools and techniques far beyond what would have been available to a single individual working alone in a remote mountain location. Additionally, the investigators discovered evidence of what they described as organized material storage within the accessible portions of the tunnel system. Large quantities of metal objects, primarily iron and steel implements that appeared to have been collected from throughout the region, were arranged in careful patterns throughout the underground chambers. When questioned about these materials, Hiram explained only that they were components for the final assembly. The Geological Survey report concludes with a recommendation that the site be subjected to more thorough investigation by specialists in mining engineering and construction techniques. However, this recommendation was never acted upon, primarily due to the onset of economic difficulties that diverted state resources to more pressing concerns. For several years following the Geological Survey, the Ashworth property remained relatively quiet. Hiram continued his underground work, but the disturbances that had characterized the earlier period seemed to have subsided. Local residents reported occasionally seeing him in the vicinity of his excavations, but the nighttime sounds and mysterious lights became less frequent. During this period, several attempts were made to learn more about Hiram's background and origins. County officials conducted searches of records from surrounding areas, hoping to find some documentation of his previous residence or activities. These searches proved entirely unsuccessful. No records could be found of any individual matching Hiram's description in any of the surrounding counties, despite his distinctive appearance making him virtually impossible to overlook or forget. More puzzling was the discovery that Cordelia Ashworth herself seemed to have no clear recollection of how Hiram had come to be living on her property. When questioned by various officials over the years, she provided different and often contradictory accounts of their first meeting. Sometimes she claimed he had appeared at her door seeking shelter during a storm. Other times she suggested he had been recommended by a traveling preacher who thought she needed help maintaining the property. On one occasion, she even stated that she couldn't remember a time when he hadn't been there. These inconsistencies in Cordelia's account raised questions about her mental state and reliability as a witness. However, medical examinations conducted by Dr. Penfield and later physicians found no evidence of cognitive decline or psychiatric disturbance. She appeared to be in good physical and mental health, with her memory intact regarding all other aspects of her life. The confusion seemed to center specifically around the circumstances of Hiram's arrival and the early period of his residence at the cabin. This period of apparent calm ended abruptly in the autumn of 1930. On October 31st, residents throughout the valley reported seeing an unusual glow emanating from the direction of Sourwood Ridge. Unlike the moving lights that had been reported in previous years, this was described as a steady, bright illumination that lasted throughout the night and could be seen from several miles away. When daylight came, a group of local men decided to investigate. What they found at the Ashworth property defied easy explanation. The cabin appeared to be empty, with no sign of Cordelia or Hiram. More disturbing was the condition of the excavation site. The entrance to the main shaft had been sealed with what appeared to be a mixture of concrete and metal fragments, creating a barrier that would have required considerable effort and expertise to construct. Most puzzling of all was a message that had been carved into the wooden door of the cabin. In large, precisely formed letters, someone had written, "The preparation is complete. The emergence begins." Efforts to locate Cordelia and Hiram proved unsuccessful. Neither was ever seen again in the immediate area, and no records of their departure or destination have ever been found. The cabin remained empty for several months before being claimed by the county for unpaid taxes. The property was eventually sold to a local farmer who planned to use it for grazing land. However, the new owner never took possession of the property. According to family members interviewed many years later, the farmer visited the site once to assess its potential and left within hours, refusing to discuss what he had seen there. The property was quietly returned to the county and has remained officially vacant since that time. The official records of Hiram Kincaid end with his disappearance in 1930. However, the story took on new life in the 1960s, when a graduate student in anthropology at West Virginia University began researching the folklore and oral traditions of the region. During the course of her fieldwork, she encountered multiple references to the Ashworth guest and became intrigued by the consistency of the accounts despite the passage of time. Professor Catherine Whitfield's research, completed in 1967, represents the most comprehensive examination of the Hiram Kincaid case that has ever been undertaken. Her dissertation, titled "Anomalous Individuals in Isolated Communities," a case study from Pendleton County, attempted to apply modern anthropological and psychological analysis to the surviving documentation and oral testimony. Professor Whitfield's work revealed several previously unknown aspects of the case. Through careful research in church archives, court records, and family documents, she was able to establish that Hiram's appearance at the Ashworth cabin in 1923 had coincided with a period of unusual atmospheric disturbances reported throughout the region. Meteorological records from the period show an unusually high incidence of unexplained electrical phenomena, including ball lightning and sustained aurora-like displays at latitudes far south of where such phenomena normally occur. More significantly, Professor Whitfield discovered evidence that suggested Hiram Kincaid was not the only individual of his type to appear in the region during this period. Hospital records from 3 different counties contained references to patients with similar physical and behavioral characteristics, all appearing within a 5-year period between 1921 and 1926. In each case, the individuals were described as possessing exceptional size, unusual facial structure, and what one doctor characterized as cognitive abilities that appear to operate according to principles unknown to conventional psychology. Most disturbing of all was Professor Whitfield's discovery of a confidential correspondence between Dr. Penfield and a researcher at Johns Hopkins University. In a letter dated December 1923, Dr. Penfield wrote, "I have encountered a patient who presents characteristics that challenge fundamental assumptions about human development and capability. I am increasingly convinced that we are dealing with some form of biological variant that has emerged spontaneously in this isolated population. The implications, if my hypothesis is correct, are profound and potentially disturbing." The Johns Hopkins researcher's response, found among Dr. Penfield's papers after his death, suggested that similar cases had been reported in other isolated regions throughout the eastern United States. The response included a request for detailed documentation and biological samples, along with a warning that the information should be shared only with qualified researchers and should not be made public until we better understand the scope and implications of what we are observing. Professor Whitfield attempted to trace this correspondence further, but discovered that both Dr. Penfield's files and the Johns Hopkins records had been destroyed in a fire that occurred in 1954. The timing of this destruction, less than 6 months after Dr. Penfield's death, struck Professor Whitfield as suspiciously convenient. Her research also uncovered evidence that the geological disturbances in the Sourwood Ridge area had not ended with Hiram's disappearance. Seismic monitoring equipment installed by the State Geological Survey in 1935 detected periodic underground tremors in the region until 1962, when the monitoring program was discontinued due to budget constraints. The final report from this program, filed in the state archives, noted that the tremors followed an increasingly regular pattern that suggests artificial rather than natural causation. Perhaps most intriguingly, Professor Whitfield's research revealed that the Ashworth property had been the subject of several clandestine visits by federal officials during the 1940s and 1950s. Documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, heavily redacted, indicate that agencies including the FBI and what would later become the CDC had conducted biological and environmental assessments of the site on multiple occasions. These visits were apparently prompted by reports from local residents of continuing strange phenomena in the area. Throughout the 1940s, hunters and hikers reported finding unusual structures in the forest around the old Ashworth property, including what appeared to be metal frameworks partially buried in the ground and concrete installations that seemed to serve no identifiable purpose. More disturbing were the biological anomalies that began appearing in the region. Local veterinarians reported an unusually high incidence of developmental irregularities among livestock in the area, with animals exhibiting size and structural characteristics that differed significantly from normal patterns. Similar phenomena were observed in wild animal populations, with hunters reporting encounters with creatures that appeared to be familiar species, but with modifications that they could not explain. Professor Whitfield's dissertation was completed in 1967, but was never officially published. According to university records, the dissertation committee accepted her work, but recommended that it be classified as restricted access due to what they termed potential public safety concerns. Professor Whitfield herself left the university shortly after completing her degree and took a position at a small college in Oregon, where she focused on conventional anthropological research for the remainder of her career. The Whitfield research might have remained buried in academic archives indefinitely were it not for a chance discovery made by a geology team in 1969. Researchers from the United States Geological Survey were conducting a comprehensive mineral assessment of the region when they decided to investigate the persistent reports of underground disturbances in the Sourwood Ridge area. Using newly developed ground-penetrating radar technology, the geological team made a discovery that validated many of the most extraordinary claims that had been made about Hiram Kincaid's underground work. The radar revealed an extensive tunnel system that extended for several miles beneath the surface of the Ashworth property and surrounding areas. The construction was far more elaborate than had been suspected, with multiple levels of chambers and connecting passages that displayed a level of engineering sophistication that seemed impossible for a single individual working with primitive tools. Most remarkably, the radar indicated that portions of the tunnel system remained active, with what appeared to be artificial lighting and ventilation systems still functioning more than 40 years after their construction. Temperature sensors lowered into accessible portions of the system detected environmental conditions that suggested ongoing occupation or use. The geological team's report, classified immediately upon completion, recommended that the site be subjected to comprehensive excavation and study by a multidisciplinary team of scientists. However, this recommendation was never implemented. The property was quietly acquired by the federal government through eminent domain proceedings, and access to the area was restricted indefinitely. Local residents remember the federal acquisition as a confusing and somewhat frightening process. Within a period of weeks, the entire Sourwood Ridge area was cordoned off, with armed guards posted at all access points. Families who had lived in the region for generations were relocated with minimal explanation and substantial financial compensation that ensured their cooperation and silence. The official explanation for these actions was that the area had been designated as a wildlife preserve due to the presence of endangered species. However, no wildlife preserve was ever established, and the area has remained essentially vacant since 1969. The few individuals who have attempted to approach the former Ashworth property in recent decades have reported being intercepted by security personnel who refuse to identify their agency or authority. What happened to Hiram Kincaid and Cordelia Ashworth remains officially unknown. However, there have been persistent reports over the years of individuals matching their descriptions being seen in other remote areas throughout Appalachia. These reports typically describe encounters with exceptionally large individuals who demonstrate unusual capabilities and who seem to be engaged in excavation or construction projects similar to those observed at Sourwood Ridge. A forest ranger in Kentucky filed a report in 1952 describing an encounter with a man of unusual size and appearance who was observed moving large stones by hand in a remote area of the Daniel Boone National Forest. When the ranger approached to investigate, the individual displayed what the report described as immediate awareness of my presence from an impossible distance and disappeared into the forest before any contact could be made. Similar reports have come from Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee, always describing individuals who match the physical characteristics attributed to Hiram Kincaid, and who seem to be engaged in large-scale but mysterious construction projects in isolated areas. In each case, official attempts to investigate these reports have been unsuccessful, with the subjects disappearing before any formal contact can be established. The most recent confirmed sighting occurred in 1965, when a team of researchers studying cave systems in eastern Tennessee reported finding evidence of extensive artificial modifications to a natural cave complex. The modifications included metal framework, lighting systems, and precisely carved chambers that the researchers described as suggesting tools and techniques beyond anything we can identify. The researchers also reported finding a message carved into the rock near the entrance to the modified cave system. The message read, "The work continues, the emergence approaches, the barriers grow thin." This discovery prompted a federal investigation that resulted in the cave system being sealed and the area being declared off-limits to civilian access. The research team was debriefed by federal officials and instructed not to discuss their findings publicly. However, one member of the team later provided information about the discovery to a journalist, who was prevented from publishing the story by what he described as pressure from sources I cannot identify. The pattern of official suppression and controlled access that has characterized the Hiram Kincaid case suggests that government authorities possess information about his nature and activities that has never been made public. The consistent intervention in attempts to investigate related phenomena indicates a level of concern that goes beyond mere scientific curiosity or routine security protocols. Professor Whitfield, in her final notes on the case, written shortly before her death in 1995, offered a speculation that may explain the persistent official interest in Hiram Kincaid and similar individuals. She suggested that what had been encountered in the mountains of West Virginia in the 1920s was not an isolated anomaly, but rather the first recognized instance of a new form of human development that challenges conventional understanding of biological and evolutionary processes. According to this hypothesis, individuals like Hiram represent the emergence of capabilities that exist within human genetic potential, but which are normally suppressed or dormant. The isolation and unique environmental conditions of the Appalachian region may have created circumstances that allowed these capabilities to manifest in ways that would be impossible in more conventional social and physical environments. If Professor Whitfield's speculation is correct, then Hiram Kincaid and his underground installations may represent preparation for a form of human development that transcends current biological limitations. The references to emergence and thinning barriers that appear repeatedly in documented encounters might indicate an understanding of natural processes that operate according to principles not yet recognized by mainstream science. The implications of such a possibility extend far beyond academic interest. If individuals possessing capabilities similar to those attributed to Hiram Kincaid continued to develop and organize in remote areas, they may eventually represent a fundamental challenge to existing social, political, and economic structures. The persistent official secrecy surrounding these cases suggests that government authorities share this assessment and view the phenomenon as a potential threat requiring careful monitoring and control. However, there is another interpretation of the evidence that is perhaps even more disturbing. The pattern of underground construction, the references to emergence and barriers, and the apparent coordination between widely separated individuals suggest the possibility that what has been encountered is not random human development, but rather systematic preparation for something specific and unprecedented. The phrase, "the barriers grow thin," that appeared in the Tennessee cave system implies a cosmological or dimensional understanding that extends beyond normal human knowledge. If this understanding is accurate, then Hiram Kincaid and similar individuals may not represent human evolution at all, but rather preparation for contact or integration with forms of existence that operate according to entirely different principles than those that govern conventional reality. This possibility transforms the Hiram Kincaid case from a medical or anthropological curiosity into something with implications that extend beyond human science and experience. The underground installations, the systematic collection of materials, the coordination between separated individuals, and the persistent official suppression all acquire a different significance if they represent preparation for an event that would fundamentally alter the nature of existence itself. Today, the forests of Sourwood Ridge remain silent and empty, at least on the surface. The old Ashworth cabin has long since fallen into decay, and the access roads have been reclaimed by vegetation. Few people remember the strange events of the 1920s, and fewer still understand their potential significance. Yet occasionally, on quiet nights when the wind is still and the moon is dark, residents of the surrounding valleys report hearing sounds from the direction of the ridge. They describe a deep rhythmic resonance that seems to come from far underground, as if massive machinery were operating in chambers carved from the living rock. These sounds are always brief, lasting only a few minutes before fading back into silence. More disturbing are the reports of lights that sometimes appear moving through the forest in patterns that suggest intelligence and purpose. These lights are not the warm, flickering glow of lanterns or flashlights, but rather a cold, steady illumination that seems to emanate from sources that remain invisible. Witnesses describe the lights as moving in coordinated formations, as if directed by some central intelligence that understands the terrain and has specific objectives in mind. The few individuals who have attempted to investigate these phenomena directly have reported experiences that they struggle to describe coherently. They speak of encountering structures in the forest that seem to exist partially underground, with only small portions visible above the surface. They describe sounds that suggest extensive activity occurring far beneath their feet, and they report the persistent sensation of being observed by intelligence that remains hidden but actively aware. Perhaps most significantly, these contemporary witnesses often report experiencing physical and psychological changes after their encounters. They describe enhanced sensory awareness, improved physical coordination, and what they characterize as expanded cognitive capabilities. However, these improvements seem to come with a corresponding sense of alienation from normal human society and an inexplicable compulsion to return to the areas where their experiences occurred. The pattern suggests that whatever process began with Hiram Kincaid in the 1920s has continued to develop and expand over the intervening decades. The underground installations may represent not merely hiding places or workshops, but rather transformation centers where human consciousness and capability are being systematically modified according to principles and objectives that remain beyond conventional understanding. If this interpretation is correct, then the question becomes not what happened to Hiram Kincaid, but rather what he and others like him are working to create. The references to emergence and the approach of significant events suggest that the decades of underground preparation may be building toward a culmination that will make itself known in ways that cannot be suppressed or concealed. The story of the son of the widow that science couldn't explain may thus represent not a historical curiosity, but rather a preview of transformations that will eventually affect all of human civilization. The barriers that separate conventional reality from whatever lies beyond may indeed be growing thin, and the emergence that has been so long in preparation may be closer than anyone suspects. Until that time arrives, the mountains of Appalachia keep their secrets, and the descendants of those who witnessed the strange events of the 1920s continue to watch the forests and listen for sounds that suggest the hidden work continues. They understand, perhaps better than anyone, that some explanations are not found in science textbooks or government reports, but rather in the direct experience of realities that exist beyond the boundaries of normal human knowledge, and in the depths beneath Sourwood Ridge, where tunnel systems extend through miles of solid rock and chambers carved by unknown methods serve purposes that remain mysterious. The preparation continues. Whatever emergence has been so long anticipated draws steadily closer, and the barriers that have maintained the separation between worlds grow ever more tenuous. The federal authorities who maintain their silent vigil over the restricted areas know something that they will not share with the public. In their classified files, detailed reports document phenomena that challenge every assumption about the nature of human existence and the boundaries of physical reality. But these reports remain locked away, their implications too dangerous to acknowledge openly. For now, the official story remains simple. Hiram Kincaid was an unusual individual who appeared in an isolated community, engaged in eccentric construction projects, and disappeared without explanation. The underground installations, if they exist at all, are merely the abandoned remnants of his private obsessions. The continuing phenomena reported in the area are simply the products of overactive imaginations and local folklore. But those who have seen the classified files who have witnessed the evidence that cannot be explained away, know better. They understand that humanity may be approaching a threshold that will change everything we thought we knew about our place in the universe. The emergence that Hiram Kincaid spent his years preparing for may not be a distant possibility, but an approaching inevitability. And when that day comes, when the barriers finally fail and the hidden reality reveals itself, the world will understand why certain secrets had to be kept, why certain knowledge was too dangerous to share, and why the preparation that began in the mountains of Appalachia nearly a century ago was the most important work ever undertaken by human hands.